plants wouldn't grow without it. But measuring it involves trying to distinguish some kind of service value of it, would require somehow finding a benchmark, a baseline against which to compare all that plant growth with some alternative. And if the alternative were no photosynthesis, that doesn't really seem like an appropriate measure, right? If there were no photosynthesis, we sort of wouldn't be here anyway, right? So then maybe what he means by that is simply that the function is kind of a static background condition that is important, but not subject to economic valuation for the purposes at hand here. A service, on the other hand, is something that they're clearly going to try to define a price for. Now, you can read the article and you can look, and there are lots of complicated tables breaking out the world into different kinds of ecosystems and combining various methods of these different kinds for each system to try to arrive at a value, okay? And they are fully aware that this is sort of a mishmash of methods, and that there are all kinds of questions you might raise about how they've defined the biomes, and how they've chosen the different methods for each one, and which services might be excluded from different parts of the world because of these decisions they made about what kinds of things they are measuring. And they're also fully aware that they can't measure some components, and therefore have to put those aside for the time being, right? This was offered as a sort of preliminary, gross picture kind of estimate of the world's ecosystem services. And here's a map that attempts to depict the value of ecosystem services from some kind of negligible extent all the way up to super intense, right? Any thoughts about this map? Reactions to this map? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so this map, in the first place, this map is obviously a sort of moment-in-time snapshot that reflects the methods underlying the attempts to put the prices on these ecosystem services, and is subject to change over time. Yeah.
I really don't like the areas where they say it's negligible.
Okay.
Because it seems to suggest, well, then why don't we exploit the Sahara Desert as much as we feel like, since there's absolutely no ecosystem service value.
Okay, this is perhaps a nice articulation of one of the criticisms of this effort. It's like, this would seem to suggest that there's no ecological value to the Saharan Desert, and therefore we should feel free to do as we see fit with it, with no concern for environmental consequences. Yeah. You had a question?
I don't think this map takes into account the non-derivative value, or other types of value that individual people would say that.
Okay. Okay, the indigenous or religious or particularistic values that specific populations or groups of people might have for for discrete places is totally overlooked in this map. And I think that they would say, you're right. That's just something we don't know how to handle at this point. I mean, how do you deal with the fact that there might be 100 people somewhere on this planet who are extremely attached to a specific place and who consider it to be basically the most important thing on the face of the earth, right? Yeah. Whose values are mapped by this map, and who gets to define the tools? Excellent question. And clearly this is, they're going to say, well, we're just trying to get this sort of preliminary picture in place. We're a bunch of scientists and economists, and no, we don't represent any particular vantage point. But of course, you can look at them and say, how could that be, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's entirely fair to look at this map and look at the people who produce it and ask, what is the personal or particularistic perspective that you guys and gals bring to this effort? And perhaps this map is a gross distortion that we don't know yet what the consequences are going to be. Yeah.
Yeah, the map is very static in time. It doesn't really reflect changes in supply and demand and scarcity that would affect value. Like, value can change every day depending on some government exploits one resource and the next day that resource.
Okay. Okay. We've acknowledged that this is a snapshot in time and it's subject to change, and perhaps radical change. We might start just by, what are the places that seem to have the least and the most economic value? Can we offer any thoughts about those patterns? Yeah. Okay, so what we see, it's clear that deserts, in general, seem to have lower value than wetter areas. So the Sahara, Western Australia, parts of the southern cone of South America. It also looks as though Antarctica and Greenland fall in this category. They also might be characterized as deserts, believe it or not, despite all that ice. Anything else? A lot of arable land in the United States somehow doesn't get on this map as valuable. That is a very interesting question for which I do not know the answer. Javier? Okay, well, that's an interesting question. Do they attempt to estimate values using tax assessment data to derive value? So you mean like the taxes paid to support national parks, for example, that sort of thing? Ooh. I don't blame them if they think that the court system and its role in enforcing laws is not something they want to try to calculate as an ecosystem service, right? Other thoughts? Yeah. No. Well, no, actually, it looks a little bit like all of the ocean is rated as one value, but they actually conclude, where is it? 63% of the value of everything comes from marine systems. And what they're talking of, which more than half are coastal systems. And if you go back and look at the map, you'll see that a lot of ocean is orange, and it's because of the high value of those systems primarily for fisheries. But also, there's some other systems. If you really work your way carefully through all of the different components and things that they're looking at, coastal systems emerge as extremely valuable. And I think that also reflects, in part, in a derivative fashion, the fact that that's where most of the world's population lives, too, right? So if you're looking at real estate values and human uses of harvesting of fish, that kind of thing, you're going to see it concentrate along the coastal margins of continents. But it is interesting. I don't believe any effort was made here to calculate, for instance, the value of keeping the ice on Greenland and not having it melt into the oceans, right? That maybe is a function in this system rather than a service, right? But it's true that if you tried to say, well, the world's coastal margins would be flooded if that ice melted, therefore, that ice on Greenland is worth a great deal. Yeah.
It seems in some areas that the value of ecosystems is concentrated in large centers or large industrial cities, for example, China and stuff like that, where
Well, let's talk for a minute about the red areas, where they're concentrated. I mean, we've talked about coastal systems, marine systems. Clearly, there's some kind of preference here for rainforests, right? Yeah? Okay, there's some kind of way in which this map is reflecting a high valuation placed on biodiversity and forest systems, which I would suspect, I mean, there's a couple of interesting things that might be said about this. One is hot, moist systems have much greater rates of above-ground net primary production than other systems, which might be expected to have a kind of effect on the overall valuation here, right? There's just a whole lot more growth, not to mention diversity of organisms in these systems, and that perhaps is reflected here. On the other hand, it's a little interesting. I mean, there are large areas of the Amazon there, for instance, that I don't believe are characterized by super large industrial production, right? Or, big numbers that you can attach to discrete products in the way that you can fisheries, for example. Okay, and one more.
Well, I mean, in comparison to the red in rainforest, it seems like the red listed around Siberia and Alaska. I mean, that doesn't seem to add up.
What about the red in Siberia and Alaska?
I mean, I was going to say it might include like oil interests, which may show how the people who are making these maps have specific interests in a specific period of time.
Okay, what explains the red in Alaska and Siberia? Anybody have a thought? I don't believe it's oil reserves. I would guess it actually has to do with fisheries again. Perhaps also forests, but I'm not. I mean, for Siberia anyway. But that would bear further scrutiny, I think. Yeah. I believe it's intended as the actual value at a point in time, but it involves using all those different methods of calculating value, some of which can seem more like potential than actual value, right? So they are trying to, I mean, the actual value of storm protection is not something for which there's a sort of obvious price, and they have to come up with ways of trying to put a price on them, right? All right, last question, then I think we'll break. They don't include finite resources. There again, that's actually an extremely important point. A finite resource, by definition, is one that we will not recover from exploitation, and to that extent is treated as a stock that can only be depleted, and not a service that is an ongoing flow from that stock. And we'll talk about that after the break. But let's take a quick 5-minute break now. Okay. Here we go. Now, as usual, I think I'm going to have to accelerate my way through these slides here compared to the first half of class. So, what do they end up with? The value of everything, as they call it. We estimated that at the current margin, ecosystems provide at least $33 trillion US worth of services annually. The majority of the value of services we could identify is currently outside the market system. 63%, as I mentioned earlier, of this $33 trillion comes from marine systems, more than half of that from coastal marine systems. Nutrient cycling alone was worth $17 trillion. And global economic output, $1999. Is that right? What? Is this a 97 article? I've been calling it 97. Maybe it's later. Was $18 trillion. In other words, the value of everything was nearly twice the value of all the marketed economic activity in the world at that time. And this is the big kind of point where your jaw is supposed to drop, and you're supposed to wake up from the newfound revelation with an entirely different perspective about the relative importance of ecosystem services and standard economic measures of production and well-being, right? In other words, all the GDP added up for the entire world doesn't come close to equaling the value of these natural ecosystem services. Yes? Oh, it's easy to come up with a second number. You just take the standard economic measures of growth. The ecosystem services number is the result of that very, very complicated methodological mishmash that I referred to earlier, right? Okay, so they narrowed it down to a sort of list of services they were going to try to measure. They granted that they weren't going to measure all the others. and they found ways of assigning prices to those indices, and they added them up. Yeah. Some of them are like that, yes. Some of them you calculate a value by looking at what it would cost to do it through sort of intentional economic activity to substitute for it, as opposed to letting nature do the work, right? So what does it cost to purify water with a purification plant, as opposed to letting water filter through natural systems in such a fashion that when it arrives at your point of use, it's still clean, and you don't need the plant at all. Some of it is like that. But like I say, it's a bunch of different measurements added together into the common metric of dollars. Yeah?
I feel like this whole study is still pretty flawed because it's just a group of individuals with a certain agenda where they want to make sure that the overall dollar value is much more than the total global economic output.
So-
And I could see that if people had a different agenda, they could easily make it less than the total economic output if they so desire.
Okay, you see a flaw here simply in the fact that there is a necessarily subjective component in deciding what to measure, and that other people using other methods could easily arrive at the opposite conclusion if they so chose. And, I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate criticism to make, although you then, I think, in turn, have some kind of responsibility to ask, okay, well, compared to what? In other words, you can still then ask, what methods did they use? What kinds of admissions do they make about the limitations and shortcomings of those methods? What are they consciously trying to do? And their own, and how might this be done any better? Now, that's the problem with that is that you are essentially granting the premise that it should be done, or that this can be done. And there are plenty of people who would say, no, this either can't be done, or it shouldn't be done. Some people, I suppose, might say that doing it is, in fact, more a reflection of a certain way of approaching things that is itself problematic, rather than that this somehow sheds new light that will change the way people think about things. And that, in many ways, is the topic of the rest of this lecture, right? What are the strengths and weaknesses, upsides and downsides of looking at natural systems this way? And we'll come back to this. In a sense, we've got a reformulation of this earlier figure, such that we have values, and on the other hand, prices and commodities, and there's a huge question mark about how to translate between the two of them, right? How to render the whole circle into some common metric that will allow you to compare things that, in many ways, aren't comparable. How do you do this? And again, some of these have been mentioned or implied in the earlier slide of the different methods or different ecosystem market relationships. You can translate value to price directly by adding up the prices of goods that are produced that are already commodities, like fish. You can think about the added value of coastal property compared to inland property for things like scenery. Or, there's a whole tourism market in homes along coasts, right? And that might somehow speak to that aspect of coastal systems. Substitution was just mentioned. What it would cost to replace a natural process with a human or technological process. Willingness to pay, what people would pay for recreational opportunities. All these things have been mentioned. These are the tools that economists use to put together this kind of study. And some of them are fairly conventional and not deeply problematic or debated anymore. Some of them are very much debated. This last one, there are plenty of economists who would say that is basically just pulling numbers out of thin air, right? And the idea that you can somehow compare those numbers and use them in the same way as some of these others is silliness. So then the next key step here, and this is not the first time this was done, but nonetheless, is the idea of converting these economic prices or using them to infer the existence of something called natural capital. And here what you've got is a kind of analogy working backwards, right? If there is something that produces a stream of services that we can understand as somehow having a price, then by simple economic recalculation, you can attribute a capital value to the system that generates that stream of services just the way you might estimate the capital of a factory in terms of the revenue stream that it produces, right? The degradation of ecosystem services represents loss of a capital asset. This is where their hope is that the powers of the world will really wake up and pay attention, right? Because all of the most powerful people in the world know that you don't want to deplete your capital. It's almost a religious principle. You're allowed to spend the dividends, the sort of revenue stream from your capital, but you're not allowed to deplete the capital because eventually that means you won't have any left. Yet traditional national accounts do not include measures of resource depletion or of the degradation of these resources. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. But the idea that there is such a thing as natural capital was greatly advanced by Costanza et al. And made into a kind of current and widely used lexicon for thinking about these questions. In many ways, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is simply a further extension of the way of thinking that Costanza and company sort of put out there in their article about the value of everything. And I want to ask, does this concept of natural capital make sense? Where has it come from? How has it changed since its inception into this discourse? And can it really do the work that these people wanted to do? And so here's Costanza and company. In general, capital is considered to be a stock of materials or information that exists at a point in time. Each form of capital stock generates a flow of services that may be used to enhance the welfare of humans. The human use of this flow of services may or may not leave the original capital stock intact. So here you've got, again, this sort of this conceptualization in which you have a stock that produces a flow, and the flow can be used sustainably, or it can be used in a way that actually depletes the underlying stock and is therefore unsustainable. And the analogy with capital in the investment sense of the term is